Greetings to everybody. I'm Chris Wickham. I'm the director of the British School at Rome, and this is a series of conversations and talks organised by John Foote from Bristol and Simon Martin from the Trinity College Rome Campus, who we're delighted to say also has a BSR connection, in conjunction with the British School, to look at contemporary research around Italian fascism and to reflect on the meanings of the movement, the regime today, and talk about new findings, new ideas. So we're going to focus today on themes of violence and the importance of the year 1921. And so we have three significant experts on fascism here. We got Paul Corner, who was professor of European history at Siena until his retirement in 2016, who has written a number of books on fascism, particularly focused on popular opinion in the fascist period. And we have John Foote from Bristol, professor of modern Italian history there, who's just about to publish a book on Italian fascism with Bloomsbury. Simon Martin, who's worked primarily on Italian fascism in sport, and two books on football and fascism. He's just about to produce a book on the myth of Giovanni Berta, a fascist martyr of precisely 1921. And I'm going to start by throwing the ball to him, Simon. Over to you in your appropriately black shirt.
I was worried about that. It's actually dark green. I did have a black one out, I thought, but I wasn't thinking about the webcam impact.
All right. Yeah.
Honestly, it's dark green.
Okay, in his appropriately dark green shirt then.
Thank you. That's better. Thanks, Chris, for that, and for calling out the colour of my shirt. Thanks also to Harriet for her part in organising what we're planning to be a series of discussions and papers around this topic, and also thanks to everybody here who's listening. As we said, we're planning on a series of these discussions. Maybe this is the first of perhaps maybe 6 sessions that we're hoping to run throughout the year, and they're going to look at this topic of violence and 1921 principally. Obviously, there's a bit of flexibility to go either side, but 1921 being the real key year for Squadrismo, and the idea really came from John and I realizing that we were once again working on quite a similar topic. We'd previously shared research interests, as Chris mentioned there earlier, on Italy and sport. John's work on his very important book on Italian football, also work on cycling. But our research on sport was very much by chance. And having worked on football and fascism myself, as Chris said, my interest in fascism and memory is not by chance. It's very much due to John's really important work on Italy's divided memory. So while, as I'm sure what will become clear, what John's working on fascism and Squadrismo now, and this promises another really important addition to the historiography. But the research that I'm looking at is, as Chris again said, was on the death of this fascist martyr, Giovanni Berta, in Florence in 1921. And this has led me to also having to consider Squadrismo and the violence with a specific reference to the city of Florence in that period. And in trying to put this into some sort of broader context, to try and look a little bit beyond what was simply happening within Florence, I owe a great debt to Paul's work, his significant outputs, most notably his work on Ferrara, but also his more recent book on the Fascist Party and popular opinion. And I say recent, I was shocked when I just checked the date of the publication, Paul, to see that it was almost nearly 10 years ago now. I see this as a book that was about maybe 3 or 4 years ago. But as one of the most important historians of Italian fascism, I'm really delighted to have this opportunity to talk with Paul and John about these. I'm really delighted that they can both be here for everybody who's listening in. Now, we've put together some questions and some themes and some points of interest that we thought would make up the basis of our discussion. We also hope they will stimulate questions from the audience, and we're also thinking that perhaps these might also be might highlight some key issues that we can try to draw out in future sessions that we still are looking to organise. So at that point, I think what we should do is really turn to the first issue that we come up with, really, to think about, and it seems quite appropriate when we're talking about squadrism, is to really think about what it was, really, or how we understand it, how we have kind of experienced it, what characteristics it had, how we've come across it in our research. And perhaps I can throw that out to John or Paul to come in.
Ron, you want to come in?
You go first, Paul, and I'll go.
Okay. Well, what is Squadrismo? Squadrismo is groups of young people, many of them former soldiers from the First World War, many of them, some of them shock troops, banding together in late 1920 and going around beating up socialists, killing socialist leaders, decapitating a very strong socialist movement. If you ask what is Squadrismo, it's a group of people who find their identity in the expression of violence, which they term violence as purification of the nation. You have to realize that Squadrism takes place in a context of extreme polarization, which has to do with the First World War, when the Italian socialists don't join in any kind of union sacrée. They oppose the war, and in 1919 they continue opposing the war. So that there's a very strong polarization between socialists and nationalists. And the violence, the extreme violence, stems from this polarization. I think there are two things to say which are important. Well, there are two or three things. One is, why in this moment, in late 1920? Why does it suddenly explode in 1920? Does it come from nowhere? I think the answer to that is no. There are precedents in Italian history which go back to well before the First World War, for groups of young people being recruited by landowners, particularly in the north of Italy, to defend strike breakers during the course of agrarian strikes in Parma in 1908, in Emilia in 1913. Groups of young people are recruited by landowners with the approval of the police authorities. They're recruited as auxiliaries and they're armed. What you get in 1920, in a way, is a sort of formalization of this practice of arming young people in order to protect the interests of the landowners. They were talking about the landowners in the Po Valley, from what they see to be the threat of socialism. The second thing to say, I think, is that the threat of socialism has to be understood very clearly here. By the time you get to October or November of 1920, the socialist movement is on the decline. In the countryside, it's on the decline. In the towns of the north, it's on the decline because the occupation of the factories has been settled, the workers have been effectively defeated. So the socialist movement is on the decline, just at the moment when the squads begin their actions. Why is this? It's because in late October, beginning of November of 1920, you have elections, local elections. These local elections are won by the Socialist Party. The fascist reaction is to the political threat of socialist councils, municipal councils, because the socialist municipal councils threaten to change levels of taxation for proprietors. They even threaten, in some cases, to expropriate property. It's at that moment when the landowners begin to help the squadristi, the fascists, giving them arms, giving them money, giving them lorries, in order for them to be able to go and carry on their actions. And I think it's important to notice that this is not precisely a reaction to the Biennio Rosso, as is normally understood. It's not a reaction to the organizations in the countryside or in the factories. It's a precise reaction to a political threat of reformist socialists. I would stress that they are reformist socialists. They're not the maximalist socialists. Final point, why do they move at this point? Why are they threatened? Why are they frightened of a political threat from reformist socialists? Because at that point, when the socialists have won an election, the state cannot move against the socialists because they've won power legally. The landowners always hope that the state will intervene on their behalf if things get out of hand. In October 1920, the state can no longer intervene, and therefore the landowners go back to their old practice, which is to take things into their own hands and arm young men in order to go and defeat the socialist organizers.
Thanks, Paul. So it's great to hear that kind of lucidity about that moment. And I've got things I might contest you about, and things that I wanted to kind of go further on. I mean, I think that one of the reasons that we thought of having this series is these kind of anniversaries, which are a bit weird in some ways because they're anniversaries of violence, but they're moments that are so decisive in Italian history of the 20th century. If you go in 100 years ago to the Po Valley, to Ferrara, to Bologna, and the countrysides around, and above all, you're very likely to come across the squadristi, especially at the weekends. They often act at the weekends, or it depends which area you're in their trucks, often using these military trucks, the 18BL, which was open at the back, driving out and to towns and kind of smashing up all of the socialist and trade unionist buildings, killing people, torturing people, humiliating people, and this being allowed to happen. And I think this is a crucial point. Generally by the police and army, were not intervening in this outbreaks of massive illegal violence, open, often in broad daylight, not always, but often in broad daylight. And that's a quite extraordinary moment of breakdown of the rule of law and order, of the liberal state, of the consensus that there kind of had been, I suppose, in liberal Italy. I agree with Paul about the continuity with some of the social violence and some of the land strike breaking, but there is also, I would argue, something very different about what's going on in 1920-21. The organisation as the political organisation of violence, the uniforms, the modus operandi, which very quickly becomes quite similar in different parts of the country. The use of batons, the use of guns, the use of castor oil, the use of humiliating tactics as well. All of those things kind of become the playbook of the squadristi. And one of the things I'm interested in, how does that happen? And I don't have the answer to that necessarily. How does it happen that the squadristi learn these things and repeat them and copy them across different parts of Italy, including the south, particularly in Puglia, but also in other parts of the south. So 100 years ago, we would find this incredible, I would argue, quite new form of political organisation, quite modern, small groups. They don't have the numbers, they don't have the majority. They're not more than the socialists. They're much less than socialists in terms of numbers, but they have a way of acting in this with this extreme violence, immediate violence, which is incredibly effective. I mean, of course, form a model for many other movements globally after 1920, 1921. And we could become, I think, next time I come back, maybe in the conversation, we can kind of drill down into the way these squadristi acted and how they learned to act and why that was so effective in 1920, 1921 in particular, running up to the 21 May elections, which is really the peak of the squadristi violence around those elections, which had been called early. But that was not the natural end of the legislature, the socialists had won the 1919 elections, which had terrified the landowners, it had terrified the ruling class, often very extreme socialists in parliament, not just the reformists were marginalized at that point on the left. So some of the things that I'd like us to think about, and this, of course, this we can think about many things, are the practice of the violence, the way the squadristi adopt those forms of violence and why they adopt those forms of violence, and the effectiveness of it. Why can't the state, or the socialists, in fact, combat that violence? And that there are many things to come back on that. But even tiny amounts of people, for example, in Bologna in November 1920, Arpinati's squadristi are a very, very small number of people, maybe in the maybe 200 at most. But they are able not just to bring down the entire local government apparatus, but also act with almost complete impunity and cause absolute chaos in a city like Bologna. And one of the questions, we could talk about the connivance of the police, but it's not just that, is it? There's something about the effectiveness of that collective use of armed violence, which is very, very extraordinary in that moment. Very shocking when you read the accounts of it, and that's something that I think would be really interesting to come back on. I'll stop for now.
Yeah, I agree with all of those points, really. I mean, John, your point about how it happened so quickly. I mean, it's a little bit of a light bulb moment for me in many ways. I mean, spent the last sort of 2 or 3 years thinking about this quite small area moment that I'm looking at, and it's something I've not really grappled with in any great detail, because it just kind of seems to happen. It just seems to, like you say, it almost comes out of nowhere. I mean, I think we do see there's certainly the ideas of the militarization of these individuals has got a part to play. It seems to me what's happening in Florence, there's certainly a lack of state will to combat this. I think we only need to look at perhaps the example of Sarzana later on in 21, when actually where there is some state will, there is the ability to actually stop these squads. I think it's a good point to come back on. The other one I'm thinking about Florence, what comes to mind in some of the things that you're saying is also this obviously the importance of the agrarian landowners and this sort of agrarian basis of the movement. But again, looking at Florence, and it's something that we talked about when I thought about maybe trying to get some comparison of the cities, and what I was really hoping particularly Paul might be able to help me with, is that within Florence it seems a little bit different to me as well, in that Florence seems to be almost quite a city-based movement. I think you're absolutely right, John, when you talk about these the sort of Sunday trips out and on their trucks out into the province. Absolutely the case, but the bulk of the squads really these people come from within. It's really very much a city-based movement within Florence, and I wonder whether that's how that compares with the other regions. I think coming back to that point about the violence as well, what I get, and it may well again be just a result of the kind of the focus that I've had by looking at Florence. So it could be a kind of methodological problem in the work that I've been doing, but I don't get any sense of coordination amongst the various squads either. So, I mean, I think, and that again raises a really interesting point about how they do become quite so effective, because I really don't get, in fact, I get the sense of the opposite in terms of Florence, that the Florentine fascism is immensely proud. It's very, very radical. It's really quite different. It's very, very violent. And I don't get the sense that they particularly want or feel the need to coordinate or collaborate with other fascist cities, with other leaders. It seems like, actually, to me, in the work I've been doing, and especially on the work of this idea about Berta, it seems to me almost as if they kind of create a tradition and a way of maintaining their own independence and their own sort of glory, and as a means of protecting their independence. So I get the sense that there's almost there isn't a sense of coordination between the groups, but that almost seems kind of illogical to me.
I could just come back to John. You talk about the small groups. I mean, a lot of the tactics and the organization of the squads obviously comes from the war, the experience of the war, you know, and particularly the experience of the Arditi, who were used to fighting in the last year of the war in small groups with daggers, jumping into the trenches, things like this, you know, and they, there's a sort of glorification of this action, which they're repeating when they're acting as squadristi in 1921. You say, you know, how does it happen? I would go back to the idea that these people are working in a country which has a very strong anti-socialist consensus in 1919 and 1920 among the people who are not socialists. The lower middle class, the middle class. There's a very strong consensus created after Caporetto. Caporetto is the 1917, the defeat in Caporetto is the key moment, because that's when the really acute polarization begins. I think that's when the democratic left identifies with the nationalist cause, and you know, this produces enormous tension within Italy. Where does the violence come from? Well, if you look at 1919 and 1920, it's a period of immense violence, incredible violence. There are 600 workers killed by the police and the Carabinieri before the squads begin their action. So there's a very strong repression from the state in this period, which the squads are able to latch on to, it seems to me. I mean, the more I look at it, the more I think there's a kind of, you know, you're right to identify elements of novelty, but the more I look at it, the more I think that there's a certain kind of continuation of activity. You look in 1918, after Caporetto in Bologna, they're already forming the memoirs of Pietro Nenni. This is very interesting. You know, the socialist leader, but he's already in a nationalist position. He's organizing groups of people in Bologna, young people, which are called citizens' defense organizations. So there are lots of these going on. If you look at 1919, the beginning of 1919, there are little fasci organizations of nationalists, of young people everywhere. Mussolini is doing nothing particularly original in 1919 when he forms his fasci di combattimento. A lot of people are doing this. So, you know, there's a sort of strong element, I think, this idea that the socialists are the internal enemy and have to be defeated, have to be extirpated. I think this goes a long way to explaining why, you know, you're right to talk about the complicity of the police, but they work in an area of sentiment which is very much in their favor.
Yes, and I think I was thinking about what it is about socialism that is so radicalizing in terms of creating the squadristi and the squads. And I think there's two things. I mean, one of which has been mentioned already, which is the social fear of revolution in terms of, you know, the expropriation of property, which is a real and constant fear. It's not something invented. I mean, it's exaggerated, but the strikes around Bologna, in the Bolognese countryside, are led by, you know, revolutionaries. I've worked quite a lot on a man called Ercole Bucco, who is a quite extraordinary personality from that period. I mean, often dismissed as a kind of, a lot of the Maximilisti are kind of dismissed as you know, verbose. And I think it was Nenni again who said every village had its Marat and its Lenin, which is a great quote, which I like to bring out at every opportunity. It might have been Tasca. Tasca's book is always very good for quotes as well. And there was that, but I think they were also extraordinary kind of orators and organizers. And those kind of strikes did really strike, you know, they're actually going to take away our land. They're actually going to take away our property, plus the occupation of factories. But I think there's also added to this is something Paul also mentioned, which is that they're traitors. Okay, they when we were fighting the war, they were fighting the anti-war battle, and that's why the symbols of hatred of the socialists are to some extent the reformists, but the really big symbols, the people the fascists really want to kill, are people like Francesco Miziano and the people who really fought against the war for the whole war, and then came back and said, I was a deserter and that was good, and I did the right thing. So I think the socialists kind of hit a lot of buttons, which, especially for the soldiers coming back, but also for a lot of the squadristi are not soldiers coming back. It's a mixture of people, I think. It's an existential hatred. It's political violence with a layer of hatred on top of it, which adds to that violence. So that when they go in the Polesine, in those incredible descriptions by Matteotti, who stands up in Parliament and describes these kind of murder squads who go out into the Polesine countryside around where Matteotti had his constituency, pull out people, trade union leaders in the middle of the night, and execute them. And this is happening on a nightly basis in 1920, 1921, an extraordinary level of kind of political assassination, really, of terrorism is happening. And again, almost, I agree there were fasci and there were defense committees, but this is surely taking it to another level of politically inspired violence, which is extremely effective in the socialist movement had faded out, but it still had institutional power and it still had control of local government. The thing the squadristi set out to do, which is something quite high level, is to destroy is to overturn democratic elections immediately. And they succeed in doing that. It takes them quite a long time to take the big cities like Milan and Turin, but they do overturn the results of those elections, including the result of 1919, more or less, and of 21 to some extent, because the socialists are still the biggest party. And that takes me back to, not to draw banal parallels with, what happened in the Capitol in Washington, but my mind was immediately thrown back to what I was reading just weeks before about this attempt to overthrow a democratic election. So that's a number of points, but I think that violence plus hatred it's an emotional violence, but it's also a cold violence. And I think that double effectiveness is really something the world has not seen until the squadristi come onto the scene. And it is something that is absolutely, it's absolutely of a huge effectiveness in a very short period of time. It managed to achieve all its aims very quickly. One more thing, Farinacci, the stories about Farinacci. And we could, I'd be really interested to hear Paul talk about Balbo and Ferrara from his work. But the story that I use in my book of Farinacci from Cremona going into the council chamber of the provincial council, just elected in Cremona, going in there and saying, I'm the 22nd, I think it's the 22nd councillor, I demand the right to speak. He hadn't even stood in the elections. And that council is never allowed to sit. It's not allowed to function. It's destroyed by violence, but before it even takes office. And I think that often this has been missed in the analyses which are over ideological, I think, and over concentrating on Mussolini of what fascism was.
Can I come in there, John, as well? I second everything that's been said here. Coming back to the violence as well, is something that I brought with. I raised as something we might come back to and talk about. And I think ultimately it comes down to fear for me. I mean, reading it seems quite simplistic in many ways, but reading some of the accounts as well, they're scary. It's you wouldn't want to be opening you wouldn't want to be opening your door to a gang of these thugs. And maybe that's perhaps we sometimes overcomplicate things, but quite simply, it's scary. And I'm not sure in that position whether I would have liked to have stood up and gone out there and resisted. And those who did resist, I think we're incredibly brave to do that. It makes me think again about, again, it's what we sort of partly not dismiss the idea of the role of the state, but I personally come back and keep thinking about the role of the state in all of this, in the sense, where is it? Where is it to stop this? It is scary. Where do people turn to? The physical violence for sure, but also as I talked about, the idea of the language. I mean, I do find that the language of the papers, and whilst they may not have an enormous readership, they might have might not be published in thousands and thousands of copies, but the language of some papers like the Sassaiola, Fiorentina, these kind of niche but really ideological fascist newspapers in Florence. I mean, it's again, it's scary, and they don't pull any punches. And it seems to me that they're just allowed to do. You're allowed to print what you like. You're allowed to print kind of open threats. So the case in Florence of Spartaco Lavagnini, who eventually gets murdered, and about 2 or 3 months earlier, I think it's the Sassaiola Fiorentina, who talk about him in a headline of the newspaper he's a morally dead man. You are a morally dead man, basically a dead man walking, because he had broke a strike, and the reference was towards his being morally dead with the socialists, but the implications was really quite clear in a big banner headline of the newspapers. And I kind of you start to wonder, it's not a surprise. And you look at other, you talk about the Capitol. It's thinking about these things as I remember reading many years ago, I think it was Fergal Keen's book on Burundi, and he talked there about the racking up of the verbal violence through media, through radio particularly, and about how it becomes kind of an everyday thing. It just becomes kind of acceptable and almost normal, and nobody does anything about this. So perhaps the physical violence, absolutely, nobody does anything to stop this. When you read the diaries of some of these, a few of the Florentines, Bancelli, Cazzesi, who leave their diaries behind, you read about the violence. Sure, the socialists who do take scalps as well. Obviously, it's not only a one-way street. They do resist, but there's never really too many reports of state forces coming to the rescue. And particularly in the case of the lead up to the case of what I've looked at with Berta, the insurrection in San Frediano in Florence, sort of 2 or 3 days. And the state forces, when they eventually get there, they're not really going there to defend this fascist assault on this working class district of Florence. It becomes a kind of almost a 3-way free-for-all. So I kind of look at it, and I kind of see a state what's really absent, and even in the reports of the Ministry of Interior, the police reports, particularly looking again around the sort of the San Frediano insurrection in Florence, looking at the death of Florence, they don't the death of Lavagnini, they don't hold back in their reports. The police reports are very quick to sort of label Lavagnini as a communist, as if this kind of has some importance. A guy's just been a gang of thugs come into an office and put 3 bullets in his head. It's not, is it that relevant that he was a communist? And the police reports seem to reflect this. So I kind of see that. Well, I wonder. I look at it and think, I'm always asking myself, where's the state here? What does the state actually do? It just seems to be absent.
Yeah, I mean, quite right. The state is absent. The state is, in many respects, an accomplice. Both the police and the army tend to sympathise with the fascists, and as we know, in the countryside, what happens if the fascists arrive and beat up the socialists and kill the socialists and then leave? And at that point, the police arrive and arrest the socialists. If you look at the figures for the number of socialists who are tried for various crimes of violence during the first years of the 1920s, and the number of fascists, it's quite ridiculous. The fascists, very few of them are ever tried. Most of them are acquitted. So even the law courts are in favour. No, I mean, you're quite right. The tensions are enormously high in this period. and I'll go back to Caporetto again. I think the fear of defeat in the First World War, the fear that the defeat is being caused by the internal enemy. This is still being played out in 1919 and 1920. I take John's point that there's something new going on here. And certainly one thing which is new about Squadrismo is the choreography. The way in which they sell themselves. I remember in Ferrara, for instance, in the autumn of 1920, when the fascists have first organized themselves, they don't really know who they are. There are less than 20 of them. They go around the streets at night making enormous noise, so that the people will think there are more of them than there really are. So they already have this idea of a minority, and of course a minority forcing its will on the majority comes from the intervention in the First World War, when the minority forces Italy into the First World War. But this idea that an elite minority is going to count in history is something which they believe in very, very strongly. Squadrismo has its choreography. It has its martyrs. When a fascist is killed, they have funerals in which the coffin is made of glass, so that everybody can see the dead body as the funeral passes through the town. Some of the murders are ritual murders as well. Some of the murders described by Francinelli in his book on the Squadristi are quite terrifying. People who, the dead body turns out to have 39 stab wounds in it, because every Squadrista has put his knife into the wound of that person. So certainly all these things are very new. There's just one point I think we haven't mentioned so far, which is about Squadrismo, which is worth mentioning, which is the legacy of Squadrismo. Because that very violent movement in the Po Valley, in the agricultural areas, where the fascism is very simple. You kill your enemies, you beat them up, you force them to emigrate to France, to Switzerland, or if possible to the United States. You just don't tolerate any kind of discussion. This is a kind of imprinting which is left with the fascist movement, I think. And Squadrismo has its impact on fascism all the way through the regime. The Squadristi become something of or the ex-Squadristi become something of a nuisance for Mussolini. But many of them who go into the fascist militia, the MVSN, continue to act as they had done in 1920 and 1921, with no regard to the law. They consider themselves to be above the law. They say that they obey the law of the nation and not the law of the state. This is a very strong legacy, I think, of a part of fascism, which follows the methods and the ideas of the Squadristi in 1921. So it is certainly a very, very important moment for the definition of what fascism will become.
Yeah, and I just wanted to add a couple of things, just bring up a couple more issues. If one is the state, which is building on what both Simon and Paul have said. I think one of the other things the state does is it ideologically buys into the motivation behind the violence. So I've seen this in the work I've done on the trials that take place in 23, 24, 25, linked to mainly to socialist violence or violence connected to the socialists in 1920, 1921. So, and without going into the details, the events of Palazzo d'Acusio, the events in Ferrara soon afterwards, the Berta events, the events in Empoli, there are moments when the socialists try and fight back, usually badly. I mean, that's my second point. I'll leave that for a minute, but it's the counter-violence is nowhere near as effective as the fascist violence. But when the socialists do fight back, the full force of the law is brought upon them. There are mass arrests in Empoli. 132 people are put on trial after the killing of 9 sailors and carabinieri by anti-fascists who mistake them, and there's a big debate about this, for squadristi in March 1921, around the events that that Simon's talking about. The trial there is extraordinary. And so the state, which is still the liberal state at that point, or is becoming the fascist state, it's not quite the full fascist state. The people who arrest everybody are still the old liberal regime. They haven't been transformed yet into a fascist, and maybe that never happens fully. But they buy into the idea that socialists are inhuman traitors, beasts, and socialist violence is depicted in that way, and the fascist violence is noble, pure, clean. And that's a really important distinction, because then we're buying into the way the choreography that Paul talks about is being played out in the liberal press and in public opinion. And so that's another battle which the fascists are winning generally, apart from when they kill Matteotti, which it kind of overturns that whole narrative. And that's another seminar in some ways. And just a word on the counter-violence. I think there's somewhat a myth on the left in particular, that if the socialists and the trade unions had been properly organized and had enough guns and had been ready to fight back, then fascism would have been crushed. I don't really buy that from what I've read, from the reports I've read, from the newspaper reports, from all the material I've seen. I don't think the socialists had any chance at all against this kind of violence with the backing of the state. And in fact, when they do fight back, it's a disaster, because the repression is so enormous that it does the work of the fascists in even quicker time. And that's time and time again that happens. The state never stands up to the fascists in the streets, apart from in a couple of isolated occasions, Modena, Sarzana, that's about it. But the socialist violence doesn't work, and it's not because the socialists aren't brave enough or aren't organized enough or aren't violent enough. It's because it simply isn't going to happen. It isn't. It just, the ability to carry out violence is just not there. And politically, the Socialist Party was not in that place anyway. So I don't buy that kind of myth, that it was just a matter of will, political will, and the fascism would have been crushed. That myth carries on for quite a long time. That's one of the legacies, I think, of the Squadron is that. And just an example, and I'll shut up for a second. The mayor of Bologna, the mayor for an hour, Ennio Nudi, he's called mayor for an hour because he is mayor for an hour. He's elected mayor, and then he never takes office in Bologna. He came back after the war, after 20 years in exile, very tragic actually story. And he said, if only we'd crushed them at the beginning, then they would never have been able to. So the myth lasts quite a long time. And I think, I don't think it was possible. That's my own that's not just an opinion, that's based on what I've read, but there may be many other opinions. I suppose we should ask just the people start putting in questions as well. Yeah, so I just think that fascist violence on the streets was massively superior. And that is the other outcome of that organization of violence, which they do so well from their point of view. Yeah.
Okay, I would like to come in here because I was trying to formulate a question even earlier, and I do think that this is the moment where we do move into wider discussion. But so I suppose I'm the start of that. But certain sections of the Socialist Party were not fluffy bunnies, and people with experience in the agrarian strikes, people with experience in Turin, they knew perfectly well that the state would come down on them, but they had known that already, and they had done it. And I can see that if you're facing a popular movement which is ultra-violent and the state's against you as well, then you've got two things. And since when they were just fighting the state, they didn't win either. But it does surprise me that although I agree with you that they weren't going to win, it does surprise me that they didn't fight more. That they didn't, that bunches of I suppose, proto-communists, because the Communist Party hasn't yet been founded, the proto-communist squadristi don't take the fight back.
Yeah, what happens in Ferrara is that the socialists use violence, usually not against people, but against animals and property. When violence is used against them, rather than fight back, they invoke the defense of the police, and the police don't defend them. And they're very much criticized for this at the end of 1920. They're saying, you know, you've consistently broken the law in your actions, but now you ask for the police to protect you. And this is illogical, and quite clearly the police are not going to protect you, because in Ferrara, for instance, two policemen have been killed in the course of 1920, and therefore the police force are not going to help the socialists at all. So they don't really have any. I mean, nobody's mentioned the Arditi del Popolo. There is this organization which attempts to fight back, but it's not very effective at all. They don't organize. They don't seem to understand the severity of the problem immediately. They assume that because fascism is so clearly illegal, that the state is going to intervene on their behalf. This is their failure, I think. Failure to read the situation. Coming back to what John was saying, and then just very briefly, you think that one of the problems of interpretation of this period has been that the Biennio Rosso has been seen as an exaggeratedly revolutionary movement by the left since the end of fascism?
No, I'm not really saying that. No, I think there is a tendency to dismiss the Biennio Rosso as just verbose and ignore the sort of extraordinary democratic gains of that period. I mean, I did work on that as one of my first ever long pieces of research, and I still have a fascination for that period. And I think it's dismissed by the early works of people like Tasca and Nenni as, this was a disaster, the Biennio Rosso and so on. And I kind of rail against that a bit. But on the other hand, there's a kind of more far left tendency to say, if we'd had more guns, then, fascism wouldn't have won, which I also don't buy. So I'm coming at it from a kind of two different points of view. It's true that the Maximalists were extremely violent, usually verbally in their language. They were, they did talk revolution, but didn't really practice revolution. And that is true. And what happens time and again, and you find this all the time, there's a socialist is killed or a trade unionist is killed, and the movement calls a general strike. Every single time they call a general strike. The general strike is completely ineffective against the fascists. They don't care about a general strike. That's not the terrain they're organizing in. They just carry on being squadristi. And so this weapon of the general strike is extremely ineffective against squadristi violence, which is much more effective on the terrain it's working on, which isn't social. It's not a class. I don't buy that. That was another kind of classic interpretation. It is to some extent, but I don't think that's to say it's just the ruling class using guns, I think is also a problem. But the general strike is a weapon, and again that's proven to be the case. And in fact, the last kind of great general strike in 1922 is a complete disaster, the legalitarian one. So they don't have the weapons, they don't know what to do, because it's not the terrain they're used to struggling on. And they don't have any conception of that terrain. That's what I think is happening.
I agree on that, John, as well. That's something, again, what happens in Florence, the concept of the general strike. I mean, it happens after that process of the sort of 2 or 3 days which leads up to Berta's death. We get the death of a railway worker, we get the death of Lavagnini, which get followed by a general strike, we get the insurrection in San Frediano, and it's exactly that. They just don't have the resources, there isn't the organisation, they just can't do anything to defend this at all. The other thing I think, which is maybe what you were perhaps talking about, is I think there's also an exaggeration of socialist strength which continues afterwards as well. I think fascism also, to a degree, has almost an interest in playing it up, and it becomes a recall. It's almost a dog whistle back to the fascism or the squadrismo della prima ordine, the early days, in the sense that whilst the socialist threat clearly quite quickly gets neutralized, if we've then got no enemies to be worrying about, then squadrismo kind of loses its modus operandi, its reason of being. Sorry. So I think something, looking at this myth again of Berta, it seems to me that it comes back at certain periods of life gets breathed back into it at certain periods of time, almost as a regenerational thing, to sort of regenerate strength and interest in the movement by exaggerating the socialist threat or looking back to how bad the socialist threat was. It's not really in the regime's interest to be saying in the mid-1920s there's a threat from socialism, of course not. But we look back and say, look how bad it was, look how dangerous it really was, and how did we conquer that? How did we go against that? And this is what we need to keep doing. So there's almost an interest to keep ramping up or replaying that as well. So I think that's where and it connects with what Paul was saying, partly about the legacy and the memory of this, which kicks in.